Hey everybody, Charlie Stevens here. Thank you so much for joining me for another guitar lesson. Okay, so today I'd like to start learning about music theory. So music theory is a little bit daunting to people for some reason. I've met people who don't really like theory very much. I think it's sort of an intimidation factor. I think once you get into it, it's fine, but I think it can be a little bit intimidating to first get into. Because music is a language, and music theory is almost like a separate vocabulary that we use in our spoken language to communicate about that language. Okay, so I find it really cool. I'm really fascinated with theory. I love studying it. I love thinking about it. It really makes it possible for me to communicate with other musicians if I'm aware of the theory behind certain things. But, I get where people are coming from who might not be into it either, because it's not an end-all be-all. There's plenty of great players that were not super knowledgeable theoretically who could still play very well. So if you want to be in that camp, you really have to listen to recordings and learn what they're doing note for note, and eventually you'll just sort of understand the language of music without really needing to put it into these theoretical terms. But it's my hope that you'd learn how to do both those things, and you'd be able to learn by ear, but also have a strong foundation in theory as well. And to really understand theory, we have to talk about the major scale. Okay, so we learned the major scale on this channel. We learned a C major scale in open position. And I briefly mentioned in that lesson that that's sort of like the grammar that we use. Really, that's the basis for how a lot of the other terms we use in music theory, that's sort of where they come from, is the major scale. We'll refer to that scale oftentimes to communicate things. So in that last lesson, we learned where the notes were to play it, but we didn't really talk about what was going on. Okay, so today we're going to kind of put the major scale under the microscope and see how it works. Okay, so the key of C is a great scale, great major scale that is, because it does not use any of the sharps or flats. Okay, so this uses only the natural note names, which, if you remember from our musical alphabet lesson, in music we use part of the English alphabet from A through G. We don't go any further than that, although in Germany they use H, so you can figure that one out another time. But we use A through G. So that's 7, but we actually have 12 notes before the whole thing starts over. So a major scale actually has 7 different notes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And 1 again. This is a duplicate of this one, so I don't have to call that an 8th note, which is a type of rhythm in 8th note actually. That is 8 notes. This is why we call it an octave. But usually we just call that one 1, scale degree 1, and because there's only 7 different notes. Okay, so we also have sharps or flats. So the key of C doesn't use any of the sharps or flats. It just uses the 7 notes that we want for a major scale. Okay? And now this ends up being a very certain pattern too. So if we look at what's going on here, we have the note C, the note D, the note E, the note F, the note G, the note A, the note B. That's all 7, and finally for a little resolution we can play the first one again, the note C. Okay, so now let's look at what's going on there. So the distance between notes is called an interval. That's the term that we use to measure how far away notes are. And if we look at what's happening in a major scale, we will see that there are certain intervals at work in between the notes here. So from C to D is called a major second. And we'll do a whole lesson about intervals at another time, so don't worry too much about that. But this lesson I think should come before that, because the reason we call this a major second is because this is the second note in the major scale. Okay, but again, we'll talk about the intervallic names another time. Another name for that, from C to D, which you may remember from our musical alphabet lesson. Please check that out if you haven't watched it yet. But from C to D is actually a whole step, right? So remember, a half step is the distance from one note to the very next note. That's one key on the piano to the very next key, or in our case, one fret to the very next fret. A whole step is 2 frets away. Okay? So the second note, our major second, that happens to be 2 frets away. C, here's D. We're playing it on our open string, but we can hear those are the same. And we actually learned that long ago too, when we were learning about the names of our strings and how to tune. We learned that D is on the 5th fret of A, but it's also on the open D, right? So really, C sharp would have been 1 fret away. Here at D is 2 frets away. So that's a whole step. So between C and D, we get a whole step. Okay, now we have to look at the relationship between D to E. Okay, let's see, D. I can really even see this time that it's 2 frets again, right? I didn't have to even change strings, so it's much more obvious. From the open string to the 2nd fret, obviously that's 2 frets. So that must be another whole step, right? So far we have a whole step, followed by another whole step. Okay, what's the next note in the key of C? Well, we know it's all the natural notes. A, B, C, D, E. We're on E. What's the next letter in the alphabet? F. Okay, and we learned that that was here on the 3rd fret, right? That's because E does not have a sharp. The note E doesn't have a sharp. The next one goes right to F. Okay, so that time we got a half step here from E to F. Okay, that allowed us to keep all the natural notes with just a half step. Okay, now we have to look at what happens from F to G. A little trickier because I'm crossing strings again. Let's see, do I have this G on my D string? Should be on the 5th fret, right? It is. Okay, now I can see that I came from the 3rd fret, now I went to the 5th, that's 2. So from F to G, that's another whole step. Okay, from G to A, well, that's another easy one. I can really see that from 0 to 2, obviously that's 2. So that's another whole step. Okay, from A to B, changing strings there, but I happen to know that B is here on the 4th fret of G also, because A has a sharp, so we had to skip that one. So if we wanted to go to B, must be a whole step, right? Okay, now we're on B, and we need to go to C, which is right here, a half step away. Okay, so we get this pattern that emerges. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Okay, this is why the key of C is so cool, because sometimes when we have those half steps, there isn't really like a sharp after E. The very next note is only a half step away, F. Well, that's what we get here. Same thing with B. There isn't really a sharp after B. The next note away is a half step, C. Okay, so this one just really works out. All the half steps are in the right spot to create this scale. Okay, and it's sort of historical how this all came about as well. It started with singing in churches, chanting, and things like that, and people would get more and more formalized about writing down what they were singing, and then they started coming up with scales. So initially they had this. A 4-note scale. Okay, that can be called a tetrachord, kind of a fancy music theory nerd term, so don't worry too much about that. But tetrachord basically means it's like a 4-note chord, or in this case, group of notes scale. And they really liked that. And then they realized, so what is that? Whole step, ending with a half step. They really liked that tetrachord. And then they realized if they started that here on G, they could do the same pattern. Whole step, A, whole step, half step. Okay, so the major scale that we know is sort of 2 tetrachords stacked on top of each other, separated by a whole step. Okay? Separated by a whole step. So really this one could be thought of as having 2 different tonics. which is why this is called a diatonic scale. If you hear a diatonic scale, that's referring to a scale, and we're talking about the notes that are in the scale, as opposed to a chromatic scale, which is the same thing as the musical alphabet we learned. That means all of the notes. That's chromatic, whereas diatonic are just the notes in the scale. So that's how we use the term diatonic, but what it's really telling you is there's sort of two tonics in there from this older way of thinking where we put these two things together. So this is actually a pretty easy pattern to memorize. Whole, whole, half. So from C to D, whole, D to E, whole, E to F, half. Then the two tetrachords are separated by a whole step, F to G, whole step. Now we do that pattern again, whole, whole, half. Whole, whole, and half. Okay? So this is kind of a theoretical lesson. It's not super important that you're grasping all of this right now and immediately understanding. We're going to kind of revisit a lot of these topics, and it will become more and more clear in time. So don't let any of this scare you away or anything. I just like to explain that because I think it's really interesting. Okay, so now that we have this pattern, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, we can actually start that wherever we want to. This is how we can play in different keys. This is called transposition, when we take the same musical idea, in this case that series of whole steps and half steps, and we transpose it, meaning we start it on a different note. So here it is in C, here it's in G, here in D, A, E, B, F sharp. Keep going on and on for the entire until I run out of notes. I was doing them in the order of fifths. That's related to the circle of fifths, which is a really great way of practicing all of your keys and make sure you don't skip any, which we will talk about at another point in time. But did you hear how even though I was playing all different keys, technically I played different notes each time, but you could really tell that was the same thing, right? So that's transposition. That's what makes transposition possible, is keeping the same thing and moving it somewhere else. So understanding what is really going on with the major scale, i.e. this pattern, will allow us to move it to other keys, not just the key of C, okay? So we'll explore that some more, and we'll see how all of that works. So yeah, I kind of recommend memorizing this pattern. Depending on where you're at in your playing, it may not be super relevant to you right now, but as you get more and more advanced, I really think everybody should have that down. So whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. That's the major scale formula. Okay? Okay, so I would like you to practice that, play through in the key of C, and kind of just notice that that's a whole step. That's a whole step up. That's a half. Kind of verify. Practice to see the same way you've been, saying the notes out loud and going through, but also just noticing what happens each time we go to a new note. We've gone either a whole step or a half step, depending on what part of the scale we're currently on, right? Okay, well, thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I hope you'll join me for more guitar lessons in the future. Thanks again.